What is the difference between an amateur chess player and a professional chess player? The difference between an amateur and a professional is this. An amateur chess player does it until he gets it right, but a professional chess player does it until he cannot get it wrong. It is time to put your calculation skills to the test. We'll be examining some opening and middle game positions. And your task will be to choose the best continuation that gives you the most out of the position. Play for an advantage, create imbalances. Once your knowledge increases, and as you get better at chess, it is time to tailor your opening move choices according to the types of middle games you like to play. All of the corresponding plans based on the illustrated positions in this video all fall under the same category, known as imbalance. Amateur versus professional. However, I will assist you. I am going to give you the plan for both sides. The plan for white, 2 to e4. Plan for black, play c5. And based on the plans, depending on which side you choose to play, you must decide the best course of action. In this in-game position, black has a decisive advantage. Neither of white's pieces are on good squares. They don't occupy any files, important files. Black controls the D file, has a battery, and now watch how black demonstrates skillful combinative play. White plays the knight to a3 in order to stop the knight from going to c2, forking the two rooks. Whether b2 or d2, the bishop cannot move. So white tries to get out, but this leads to a check by the knight, a fork. And instead of capturing the rook, black goes directly for the king. Rook f8 check, king to e4, and knight to f2 check. Instead of capturing the rook, king to d5. And now what is the move? Rook to b4, cutting off access to white's king. And after rook to b4, king captures pawn on c5. And now knight to e4's check. The only move that white has is king to d5. And after king to d5, Pawn to e6 is check and checkmate. Now let's get to the heart of our lesson. Look at the chess board in front of you. What would you do if you were playing white in this position and it was your move? An amateur would look at this and would, for the most part, see a blank. And depending on their level of skill, might spot a tactic here or there, but are unable to read the board like a book. But on the other hand, a professional would automatically spot these pawns and will understand that that's where white's counterplay is, and undermining black's queenside pawns. So the move is a takes b5 followed by c takes b5, and now play the knight to c3, attacking the b5 pawn. Bishop d7, and now this is followed by knight e5. White's idea is to exploit black's light square weaknesses along the h1 to a8 diagonal and along the f1 to a6 diagonal. And now the move is b3, and after b3, pawn to b4, hitting the knight. But the tactical shot is bishop captures pawn on c4, aiming at f7. Threatening checkmate. And now queen f3 attacks the rook on a8. The rook is under fire. Rook to a7. And now the knight occupies the e4 square. And both of white's knights are centralized. Okay, you're going to be playing the white side. Your key objective is to play for an advantage and remember to create imbalances. Okay, let me give you the opening moves first. This is the Queen's Gambit declined. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, castle short, c takes d5, e takes d5, and now we have e3 and c6. Heading for the Carlsbad pawn structure. Now bishop d3, knight b to d7, queen c2, and rook e8. White castle short, knight back to f8. Pawn to h3 to stop bishop g4, bishop e6, and now rook b1. So what is your plan for white? And whatever plan you choose should be based on one or more of the following imbalances. 1. The principle of opening development, which states that both players are to try and make their minor pieces superior to their opponent's pieces. Pawn structures, which states that pawns are to be played systematically. And 3. An advantage in space, which states that every move you make is an attack. Knight on 6 to d7. So trading of dark square bishops. And now white starts the minority attack on the queen's side. a6 and now a4, knight b6. Now although it's white's normal plan to try and undermine black's pawns on the light squares located on the queen's side, but b5 may not be uh, the best option right now. Let's say, for example, if pawn to b5, then we have c takes b, a, b, and now pawn to a5. Rook b2, uh, rook from e to c8, rook over to a1. And the problem here is that black now has an initiative on the c file. So going back, so instead, maybe the better choice would be pawn to a5. And now after a5, knight c8. The knight is headed to d6 where it will control or have influence on both the c4 and e4 squares, especially since one of white's plans is to try and push the pawn from e3 to e4. So now knight a4, knight d6, knight to c5, eyeing the pawn on b7, rook from a to d8, knight d2, and bishop back to c8, rook b to e1, and queen to h4. Now, what black does here is to, after taking care of the queen side development, is to follow up with a king side attack. So black has now began attacking white's king side, which is the usual plan for black here. So queen to h4, pawn to f4, which is probably a disaster. And now the tactic is bishop captures on h3. Now keep this in mind that strategy, or should I say tactics, is the mark of a strong player, whereas strategy and tactics is the mark of a winner. Capture, queen g3 check, king h1, queen takes h3 check, king g1, and now rook takes e3, and after the trade check, king to g2, and queen captures on d4. So far black has 4 pawns for the piece, sacrificed bishop, and also the pawn on b4 is hanging. And now let's look at the other imbalances, which states that material advantage, that if you're up material, trade pieces, and if you're down material, trade pawns. 5. Look to occupy or create open files and or diagonals, including ranks. 6. The principle of weaknesses, which states that you must look for and exploit or create weaknesses in your opponent's position, which is what we're seeing black do in this game. And lastly, statics versus dynamics, which states that you should decide when you must play positionally or tactically. But keep in mind that just because you see a chance to initiate a tactic doesn't mean you should. The tactic you see may not be playable based on the position on the board. Now here's a game in which black uh, procrastinates when it comes to carrying out the king side attack like he should. This is the queen's gambit declined, and the same going into the Carlsbad pawn structure, and the opening moves are d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, pawn to c6, bishop to g5, knight b to d7, c takes d5, e d5, and now e3. And from here, the continuation is bishop to e7, preparing a kingside castle. Bishop d3, black castle short, and now queen c2. Rook to e8, white castle short, knight to f8, h3. Now g6. Now when you see this move here, black is planning to play the bishop to f5 to trade off the light square bishops. But let's see how he does it. Rook on a to b1. You are prepared now for the minority attack on the queen side. And so the continuation from here is knight to e6. The knight is headed to g7 in order to prepare the bishop trade on f5. And now bishop to h6, knight g7, b4, a6, a4, and now bishop f5 to trade off the light square bishops. Now we didn't see that plan in the first game or previous game. Bishop f5, and now bishop captures on g7. If king captures on g7, then white will continue with bishop f5, so therefore black plays bishop captures on d3, and after queen captures on d3, king takes g7, and now b5. Here, now, white plays b5, which was not the good choice in the first game, but here white can play b5 here. Now we have a takes b, a takes b, and now rook a3 with a pin on the knight. B takes c6. Now played in the game is b takes c6. Now let's go back a move. Now an amateur or a lot of chess players, probably most, would be tempted to go for tactics here. Remember what I said for tactics. An amateur, this is the difference between the amateur and the professional. This is what separates the two. Amateur would see an opportunity to pin the knight with queen a5. But white will just continue with rook on f to c1, and now bishop to b4. Now it appears that black is winning here. But after pawn captures on b7, rook moves over to b8, but knight to e5 wins. With the idea of playing the knight perhaps to c6. Now let's get back to the game. So instead of playing the queen to a5, black just simply continues with pawn captures on c6. Excuse me. So we have pawn capture, recaptures on c6, and now the move is queen c2 getting off the pin, and now queen a5. Rook on f to c1, bishop to b4, rook to b3, rook over to c8, rook takes a3, queen takes a3, and now knight b1. Now here, black has not even aimed for kingside play, as in the previous game. And so white's only worry now is that black does not liquidate the c6 weakness, see the backward pawn on c6, by playing a timely c5 break with pawn from c6 to c5. So now after knight b1, we have queen a6, knight e5, bishop d6, knight d3, knight d7, knight c3, knight f6, knight a4, and pawn to h5. And so now I'm just going to speed through the game to show you the results. Knight on a to c5, bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, queen a7. Now the knight is on an absolute post, cannot be kicked by any pawns. Queen to d1. And after queen d1, we have queen e7. White plays queen a4, knight e4, queen a6, knight d6, knight d3, queen b7, queen takes b7, knight takes b7. Now we're at the end game. Knight to b4. Look at the c6 pawn. c5. There's the break. d c5, rook c5, rook c5, knight c5. Knight d5. And now h4, f4, knight e4, king f1, f5, king e2, pawn to g5, f takes g5, king g6, knight f4 check, king takes g5, knight e6 check, king f6, and knight d4. Knight c3 check, king d3, knight d5, knight f3, f4, e4, knight b4 check, king c3, knight c6, king c4, king e6, knight d4 check, king e5, Knight takes c6. King takes c6. King e3. King over. Pawn up. King over. King over. King up. Now this is called encirclement. King takes. King here. King takes. And white wins. Thank you. That is all I have. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And stay tuned for my next video.